So good evening. I'm Graham Allison, the director of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. It's a great honor to welcome you tonight to the John F. Kennedy Forum. The topic is the future of nuclear weapons. The lens through which we're going to enter that topic tonight is Countdown to Zero, a film that's been made by the producer of the movie or the film Inconvenient Truth, which was the Al Gore movie, which was part of the raising of consciousness about climate issues that led to the award of the Nobel Prize. This new film is just out. Actually, I gather that as of a couple of days ago, you can order it on DVD. What we're going to do is show some highlights from the film, about 12 minutes worth at the beginning, so just clips that have been made by the communications team here at Harvard. And then we're going to have a conversation, and for the conversation, we have some of the stars of this film. Okay? The moderator of the film is Valerie Plame Wilson. Valerie was a hard-working U.S. government CIA spy for many years until she had the bad fortune of being outed in an ugly sequence of events in the Bush administration over Iraq, which is now the subject not only of an excellent book, but a new movie, which is at the theaters right now, called Fair Game. And actually, I think the title of it is My Life as a Spy and My Betrayal by the White House. So you get the thrust of it. Matt Bunn, associate professor here at the Kennedy School, is, again, one of the experts in the film who's offering comments that the producer, Lawrence Bender, has taken for trying to help understand particularly the nuclear terrorist threat. And Rolf Mowatt-Larssen, a senior fellow at the Belfer Center currently, but who was, in his last assignment, the chief intelligence officer in the US government who was tracking weapons of mass destruction and terrorism, will also contribute to the panel, but is also featured in the film. So here's the game plan. We're going to see the excerpts right now. This will take about 12 minutes. And then we're going to go to discussion among the panelists. And then we're going to be open for questions from the floor, so you can think about your questions, points of agreement and disagreement. So let's see if we can show the film. I think we can see it up on that screen.
Enrico Fermi stood in his office and looked out over Manhattan. He cupped his hands to the size of a tennis ball. A little bomb like that, he said, and it would all disappear.
There is no doubt in my mind, if terrorists had acquired a nuclear weapon, they would not have hesitated to use it. So I guess the question is, could they ever get one? Al-Qaeda is determined to acquire nuclear weapons and to use them if they get them. In the early 90s, they tried to buy highly enriched uranium in the Sudan. They got scammed. Just prior to the 9/11 attacks, we do know that Osama bin Laden and his lieutenant, Zawahiri, sat down with 2 Pakistani nuclear scientists and discussed nuclear weapons. Before releasing the sarin gas on the Tokyo subway, the Japanese cult Aum Shinrikyo attempted to acquire a nuclear bomb in Russia. They bought a sheep farm in Australia to mine uranium to build their own bomb.
The objective of Al-Qaeda is to, quote, kill 4 million Americans, including 2 million children. This is, in his calculation, what's required to balance the scales of justice. He takes various incidents from Shatila to the war in Iraq and counts up the body count and says that's how many people we're owed, 4 million. You're not going to get to kill 4 million people by hijacking airplanes and crashing them into buildings.
Actually, I'm not that worried about nuclear weapon.
It's not one of my main worries.
I do not worry about nuclear weapons.
恐怖分子要有核武器就很担心。
Isn't everybody worried about nuclear war? That's a stupid answer, right?
Не дай бог чего, случайно даже.
I don't know, it just has never been something that I've actually had to think about in my everyday life.
美国拥有那么多核武器，那么多核弹，它一炸，好，全世界、全地球都没了。
It might, get on your conscience for a couple days maybe, and then it kind of just disappears.
那认命，那玩意儿躲都躲不了，那东西。I don't think anybody is going to use in this day and age. Ridiculous, even think about it.
What can you do? Nothing.
At the end of the day, it's one button, and there's going to be a big mess at the end of it, isn't there?
Somebody's going to make a mistake one day, and we're all going to suffer for it.
There are 3 ways to acquire a nuclear weapon. You could steal a bomb, you could buy a bomb, and you could build a bomb.
Of all the things I learned after 9/11 about terrorism intent, the most startling discovery for me personally was realizing that they were trying to build a bomb.
The hardest part of making a nuclear bomb is getting the material, the highly enriched uranium or plutonium. Many countries have these materials, and often they are poorly guarded. But if I were a terrorist intending to build a nuclear bomb and I wanted to blow up a major city, I would look to the countries of the former Soviet Union. There have been many cases involving the theft of highly enriched uranium or plutonium. And every time there has been a black market seizure of stolen HEU or plutonium, and they were able to track it back to its source, it came from Russia.
There was a case at a Russian naval base in the early 1990s. One of the naval personnel told a relative of his where the highly enriched uranium at this base was. This relative walked through a gaping hole in a security fence, walked up to what you and I would consider to be a tool shed, snapped the padlock with an iron bar. He set off no alarm. He was not detected at all. The Russian military prosecutor in that case said, quote, potatoes were guarded better. at a facility called Luch, where they fabricate fuel made from highly enriched uranium. There was a worker there who knew that as long as the output was within about 3% of the input, they figured it was normal losses to waste, and they didn't bother to investigate. So he kept stealing small amounts of highly enriched uranium day after day over a long period of time.
Надо было холодильник, плиту газовую поменять, инфляция, зарплата не догоняет ее, и никогда я не могу не купить ничего. Мне хотелось купить необходимые вещи, а дальше нормально, честно работать.
Eventually, he stole 1.5 kilograms of 90% enriched, highly enriched uranium. He set off no alarms, no one noticed. He had friends who were making their living stealing car batteries. And they said, maybe the guy in Moscow who buys our stolen car batteries will buy your stolen uranium. So they went down to the train station together, and the police came and arrested the car battery thieves, and he got arrested along with them. That's the only way he was ever caught.
We have cases in which people from the Russian nuclear arsenal were selling material, and they were captured. We have cases in which people from Russian nuclear labs were selling material. They were captured.
Almost all of those cases, until the material was seized, it had never been noticed to be missing.
All the black market seizures that I'm aware of were serendipitous. They were caught by luck. So that we don't know whether it's the iceberg or the tip of the iceberg.
Once you've moved the highly enriched uranium, you could use any number of ports in the Middle East or the Mediterranean to ship the HEU to your destination. Smuggling highly enriched uranium into the United States is pretty straightforward. Lead pipe will shield the HEU. The detector would have to be within a few inches to pick up any radiation. And then hide it amongst everyday goods.
A 100 pounds of highly enriched uranium is smaller than a football. It would fit in a six-pack of beer cans.
100,000 shipping containers go to the United States every day.
Every way that drugs come to New York City would be the same way you would imagine highly enriched uranium coming. If you have any doubt about the ability of Al-Qaeda to bring highly enriched uranium into the U.S., they could always hide it in a bale of marijuana.
The only way to eliminate the threat of nuclear terrorism is to eliminate all nuclear weapons in all countries.
We've got to ensure that never once do terrorists succeed in detonating a nuclear weapon.
Every man, woman, and child lives under a nuclear sword of Damocles, hanging by the slenderest of threads, capable of being cut at any moment by accident or miscalculation or by madness. The weapons of war must be abolished before they abolish us.
So that's countdown to zero. It's about a a little bit less than an hour long, I think, in its, how long is it?
No, 90 minutes.
90 minutes, a 90-minute film. It's available by DVD if you're interested for more. But for tonight, what we want to do is use it as a jumping off point for a conversation about two topics. First, how serious is the nuclear threat? And then secondly, what to do about it. So, Valerie, you spent a good part of your life as a career intelligence officer working on weapons of mass destruction related topics. And now you've gone through this roller coaster of recent, or at least the more recent events. And you certainly had to think and wrap your head around this topic as you were serving as the moderator or of the film. So how realistic do you regard this portrayal of what's going on?
First of all, Graham, thank you so much for having me. I'm really grateful because doing something like this is really a continuation of some of the work I was doing for the CIA. I'm really honored to be sitting with a colleague, Rolf Mowatt-Larssen, who is done amazing work that many people will never know about. And Matthew, thank you. I can't tell you how much mileage I've gotten out of potatoes are guarded better. That's such a great line. I do hope you do.
Didn't originate with me.
Well, it's really frightening, and I hope you will take the opportunity to rent the film, or it will be on the History Channel in February. So, what I would say, I'm speaking. I'm an operations officer. That is, I stick to my knitting, and I worked on these issues. And what I noticed when I was thinking about this, when I was working for the CIA and looking at these issues of nuclear proliferation, the terrorist threat, and that nexus, I realized really what I was doing was really delaying the inevitable. We were all working extremely hard and hopefully doing secure and creative operations, but it really was just pushing back, hopefully giving diplomacy and other tools time to work in trying to figure out you can't put the genie back in the bottle, but how do you get your arms around it? I really have evolved in my thinking too. I am at the point now where I do believe the only way ahead is to advocate and push for the complete elimination of nuclear weapons, because it is as I use the phrase, you have to drain the swamp. Because what has changed so profoundly since the end of the Cold War, and what happened at the end of the Cold War, everyone sort of went, phew, thank goodness that's over, and then put these issues, swept them under the carpet. But what has so profoundly changed is the emergence of terrorism. And as you saw a little bit from the clips in the movie, without question, their absolute concentration and ambition to secure a nuclear weapon and use it for their agenda, which would be a catastrophic. So unfortunately, what we're seeing in the film and what we're going to talk about is very much very much a real threat. This is not academic. This could happen. Rolf will certainly speak more to that. But I just learned the good news in all of this. I just learned just an hour before I came here that there appears to be some movement between the White House and the Senate Republicans on ratifying this New START treaty in the lame duck session of Congress. This is really significant. And it is a first step toward getting our arms around again, trying to reduce our nuclear arsenal, which as the international community, we've completely abdicated our responsibilities over the last decade. So that's the news of the day, and good news.
Well, I hope that the good news portends actually the successful ratification. And I would say we should still stay tuned and be extremely hopeful. But I think that Secretary Rice, who was here last night and whom I was on a panel with for the new congressman today, has been very clear and outspoken in her view, including to some quite relevant Republican senators today, saying this is good for the United States, which the whole whole community of military officers and the whole community of defense secretaries and former defense secretaries, Republican and Democrat, also agree. So let's hope that people rise above the politics of the setting. But Rolf, let me go to you just for a second. In the movie, I think it's Valerie comments, or I can't remember, somebody comments on these two Pakistani scientists who show up to see bin Laden in his cave or his headquarters in Afghanistan.
Right.
And I remember you were somehow entangled in that, and also in trying to explain to President Musharraf of Pakistan how he should be worried about this. So tell us a little bit about that, and about how, therefore, your assessment of how realistic the portrayal is of the threat.
Right. And as I look back over almost a decade, this film reminds me of all the work that so many people have done, not just in the United States, but elsewhere, and places like here, to try to deal with this threat. I go back to what brought me back into the agency at that time, which was to deal with this threat that Graham referred to. And 3 weeks before 9/11, the CIA had concrete, hard intelligence that Pakistan scientists had met with bin Laden. And if you can imagine this happening before 9/11, you can imagine what the ways the administration was trying to deal with that in the aftermath. And I had been on the job for literally 2 or 3 days when the director of Central Intelligence at that time, George Tenet, took me down to the White House to talk to Vice President Cheney and actually Dr. Rice about this information. And Vice President said, "Can you guarantee that that there was no exchange of nuclear material or technologies between the Pakistani nuclear system and Al-Qaeda?" And the simple answer to that question was no. And it was in that very meeting, there didn't have to be any further discussion, the Vice President, the President actually, ordered the director to go to Pakistan and resolve the matter with President Musharraf directly. So within a few days, we were on an old Air Force One from Andrews Air Force Base flying to Islamabad, had that meeting with President Musharraf. And I'll never forget it. There were 4 people in the room, and Director Tenet, and we had this discussion about it, and told the Pakistani president that here was a dinner meeting with Osama bin Laden and Ayman Zawahiri, with a scientist who had headed up the Pakistan plutonium reactor. He was a very senior person in the Pakistan program. And during the meeting, bin Laden was asking the Pakistani scientist, how would I go about building a nuclear bomb? Which was where we realized, oh my God, they're actually trying to build one. And he said, reportedly, that it would be very difficult, if not impossible, for a terrorist group to do this. The only way they could realistically try to do it would be if they could steal or buy the material or get someone to bring it to them. And then here's how you might build one. And he proceeded to draw the Al-Qaeda leader a little diagram of a functional, very crude, but functional nuclear device. And at that point, bin Laden said to the scientist, what if I already have the material? How would I go about it then? Now, that didn't mean he had it. And as events turned out, it looks, I think, like we nipped this in the bud, we, the Pakistanis, and a number of other countries. But it was the first time, I think, that the United States government came face to face with the prospect that this wasn't a theoretical threat. As Valerie said a moment ago, it's a real threat, and their intent preceded our even knowledge that they were trying to do it. I can't stress enough the reality that here we were some weeks after 9/11, and then we began to discover that Al-Qaeda had been hunting for nuclear materials and nuclear bombs since the early 1990s, and we were the ones paying catch-up, if you will, to try to make sure that they hadn't succeeded.
So, Matt, you've spent a good part of your career worrying about this problem. So how effectively do you think that the film portrays the threat as you understand it?
Well, I think the film is right on in portraying a fairly realistic nuclear terrorist threat. I mean, one thing, a lot of people think it takes a Manhattan Project to make a nuclear bomb. You know, you need billions of dollars investment, hundreds of top flight scientists. That's true if you need to make your own nuclear material, and if you want to make a sophisticated bomb that's going to fit on the top of a missile that a state might want to have in its arsenal. If you've already got the material, it's really, and all you want is a crude bomb that is unreliable and unsafe and might fit in the back of a truck. Unfortunately, study after study by the US government and by several other governments now have concluded, yes, it is at least plausible that a sophisticated terrorist group would be able to do that. In the case of highly enriched uranium, it's basically a matter of slamming two pieces together at high speed. It's not an especially sophisticated thing. The bomb that destroyed Hiroshima was a cannon that fired an HEU projectile into another hunk of HEU, basically. That's what it was. But I would say the film is, except for the last 2 or 3 minutes of the film, it's about fear, essentially. It's about the threat. And I think it's important to understand that there's hope as well. Right now, today, most of the material that was most insecure 15 years ago is dramatically more secure today. You wouldn't be able to just stuff stuff in your pocket and walk out at any facility I know of in Russia today. You would need, I still worry about theft in Russia, but you would need a more sophisticated conspiracy than, it's no longer true that potatoes are guarded better. And there are dozens of places where the nuclear material has been removed entirely, so that there's just nothing left there to steal. And one of the pieces of news that's encouraging to me is that a lot of that work was suggested by people here at the Kennedy School, Graham, myself, others. And so it's an indication that, in fact, citizens who sit down and think about a problem and make some suggestions and make some noise can make a difference. And in fact, ultimately, that's the only thing that ever does make a difference, I would argue. In the bigger picture, I mean, the film also talks about dangers from existing nuclear arsenals that might be used by accident, dangers of the spread of nuclear weapons to other countries. It is an amazing fact that we've had no nuclear weapons used in anger since 1945. I think that's a huge public policy success. More broadly, we have today 9 states out of all the states in the world that have nuclear weapons. 20 years ago, we had 9 states that had nuclear weapons. North Korea added itself to the list, but South Africa became the first country to subtract itself from the list. That's an amazing public policy success story. We had an amazing number of secret nuclear weapons programs during that time and the whole period of export operations of the AQCON network, and yet we had no net increase. And I think with the right policies, we have at least a chance of 20 years from now still having only 9 and maybe fewer, and maybe moving a long way toward the direction that Valerie is talking about of a world free of nuclear weapons. And one of the first steps is this new START treaty that's being debated in the Senate. So it's not hopeless. And there are things that individual people can do. You can call up your senator and say, vote for this treaty, support more money for locking down this kind of material. You can give money to various organizations that work on these subjects. You can keep yourself informed. There are various news sites that allow you to do that. So I think there's reason for hope. That would be my main message.
Well, I think that's a useful antidote to what could otherwise become fairly depressing. Let me piggyback on that just a minute, Matt, because I noticed that in the audience we have several of the members of the U.S.-Russian Generals Program, which is currently here at the school, and I was speaking to them on Monday. This is a program that's now run for 21 years unbroken of Russian generals and American generals who come here for an executive program and talk about common challenges and common responses or cooperative responses and places where there are differences of views. And I talked about nuclear terrorism to this group on Monday, and I said that what is the most amazing thing about the last 19 years for me in the US-Russian story? And the most amazing thing is that in 19 years, coming up on 19 years this month, since the Soviet Union disappeared, not one single nuclear weapon has been found outside of Russia that was stolen or lost. Now, how could that we know of, okay, that we've learned, found, yeah. Okay, and I wouldn't take it to the bank yet, okay, but as the time goes on, And I mentioned, and I actually quote in chapter 3 of my nuclear terrorism book on where could terrorists get a bomb, this wonderful episode from Meet the Press in December 1991. So the Soviet Union is just about to collapse. The Secretary of Defense is on Meet the Press. He's asked the question, well, if the Soviet Union were to disappear, what is going to happen to the 25,000 nuclear weapons that are in Russia or in the Soviet Union and across this vast territory? And the Secretary of Defense says, well, if they were 99% effective and there's 25,000 nuclear weapons, that would mean there would be only 250 weapons that would be, missing. Okay? And he says, in the confusion and chaos that would accompany the collapse of a country, FedEx wouldn't be able to, achieve a higher standard than that. Now, how did this happen? And what I said and what I believe strongly is first, grace and good fortune. So I give thanks for this every day. Secondly, the heavy lifting was done by Russian professionals. So let me say it again, by Russian professionals in the Russian military, especially the 12th Gumo, the people who are responsible for nuclear weapons, and the security services, well beyond normal human behavior. I mean, as I said, I'm just thankful that they were not American investment bankers, okay? Who learned to monetize their assets. These were people that thought they had a professional duty, and they conducted their duty, and then significantly assisted by American cooperative activities, including the Non-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program. So all of the points that Matt was making, I agree with strongly, but I think if you look at this story, you could kind of tell the glass half empty and, oh my God, go get drunk, but you can tell the glass half full, in which a lot of things have been achieved that would have been highly unpredictable at the time.
And one point that's important, I think, is that this is not just a Russia problem. This really is a global problem. There are over 30 countries where the essential ingredients of nuclear weapons exist in one way or another. And so this is really something I would argue, and I do argue in an annual series I put out called Securing the Bomb, that pretty much every country where these materials exist, in fact, has more to do to make sure they're secure. I did, adding on to Graham's story, I had the honor a year ago of co-authoring an article about what countries in general ought to do to secure these stockpiles with General Yevgeny Maslin, who was the commander of the 12th Guma when all those weapons came back to Russia. So he was, more than any other single human being, the guy responsible for the outcome that Graham just described. And so it was an honor to write something with him.
May I ask what, I didn't read the whole thing, but the article in today's New York Times and the WikiLeaks on the Pakistan.
Yeah.
What do you make of that?
Well, so for those who didn't see it, there was an article in the New York Times today about the fact that in Pakistan there is a small research reactor that, believe it or not, still has some highly enriched uranium left over from that was supplied by the United States decades ago. And during Atoms for Peace, we were sending highly enriched uranium to countries all over the world. By the end of the 1960s, we were sending out more than a ton of highly enriched uranium every year with literally no requirement of any kind for any sort of security. Later, the Germans made the mistake of asking for a ton all at one go, and that provoked Henry Kissinger to write on a memo the famous question, shouldn't we have a policy, question mark? And we eventually concluded that yes, we should have a policy, and part of it should be that there should be at least some level of security for these kinds of things. Anyway, we're in the middle now of a negotiation with the Pakistanis about removing that material and taking it back to the United States. But that would be a good thing to make happen, but the big picture is the Pakistanis have a lot more highly enriched uranium than that in their military program, which is under a very high level of security, I think, in general in the military program. But that security, those security measures face a higher threat than exists anywhere else in the world. This is, after all, Al-Qaeda World Headquarters. It's the place where you had insiders, very senior insiders in the Pakistani establishment, actually sitting down and meeting with bin Laden and Zawahiri. So my view is when you're assessing risk, you've got to look at quality and quantity of the material, how easy it would be to make a bomb from, how good are the security measures, what kinds of adversary tactics and capabilities could they defeat, and then what kinds of adversary capabilities and tactics are out there in that particular country. So the security system you need to get a low risk in Pakistan is different than the security system you need to get a low risk in Canada.
You also have, in the Pakistani case and in the Indian, a competition in which you've got two rapidly expanding nuclear arsenals.
That's right.
And two rapidly expanding stockpiles of nuclear weapons usable material. So I think if you were to say, in my sort of worry list of if a nuclear bomb were to explode in an American city tonight, and you said, well, what's your list of where the material came from? At the top of my list would be Pakistan.
And not only is rapidly expanding important just in terms of the number and the quantity of material, but it means that you're processing a lot of material in bulk. And when we have those thefts that nobody noticed the material was missing, that only happens when it's in bulk, right? If you've got 19 objects sitting on the shelf and you arrive the next day and there are only 18, you know you've got a problem. If you're processing it in bulk, that's when somebody can stuff a little bit of it in their pocket and nobody notices. So that is one of the especially worrisome aspects of this incipient arms race in the South Asian Peninsula.
Rolf, let me go back to you for a second on the Pakistani case, though. So I remember that you and Tenant go to see Musharraf, and you tell him, hey, this is going on. And I think, what does he say, and how do you persuade him to change his mind or did you persuade him to change his mind?
Well, the interesting thing was, just observing the man sitting on essentially a powder keg, and particularly at that time, if you go back and read the history of veiled threats and things, and Pakistan as sovereignty and sort of hanging in the balance of what was going to happen over the next few years, he was remarkably, almost eerily calm. And he heard the whole presentation, and his first reaction was, men in caves can't do this. At that point, we went into, I'd say, a part B we had scripted for that response, which is a, frankly, typical response to this day, even in the US government, I might add. Not so much, I think, this administration, but it's been we are turning a corner, I think, on the perceptions of the threat, which is good news also. We've been giving a lot of good news, which is sometimes surprising. I think it's still a very bad problem, but I think another good news story is we are slowly turning a corner on people accepting that the threat is real. In that time, but the proof of his reaction really what was to follow. We gave him the second, more in-depth brief, including the names of various people and things we asked that they would do. And then his reaction was, well, I can assure you it's not Pakistani stuff, it's Russian. Which was his way of saying, okay, if there is a problem, maybe I'll concede there's a problem. Now, certainly...
And when you have a conversation in Moscow,
it's the
same statement flipped.
Yeah. And in the U.S., rarely does anybody acknowledge that there could conceivably be an American problem.
Right. Now, I'll say, as someone who was responsible for counterintelligence in the Department of Energy, presiding over our entire nuclear establishment, we have spent over the last years billions of dollars in security upgrades after 9/11 because we're worried about our own security. We're worried about insiders in our own facilities. So, and I might stress there something I do stress to my foreign counterparts, including President Musharraf at that time and our Pakistani partners, and something we've told our Russian partners as well. Hey, the things we're talking about, we have the same problems. We've arrested employees in the U.S. establishment that have been counterintelligence or security problems. And the proof of the Pakistani resolve, though, was what transpired over the next several years, because they did do a number of things, I think, that prevented whatever threat existed to not culminate in what President Obama talks about, a single bomb detonated somewhere over the city. And when we talk about the problem being as acute as it is, you have to remember there may only be 9 nuclear states with weapons, but there are about 30 with nuclear energy that have potential sources of material. And there are roughly 50 countries that want nuclear energy that may line up that could present new proliferation challenges for us, depending on how that is managed. And we have about 23,000 nuclear weapons in the world and enough stuff to make roughly 100,000 more. And all we're talking about is enough stuff for one to get out of anybody's control and into the hands of terrorists. And that's what makes the challenge so daunting. It's not that people aren't good, aren't serious, don't take nuclear security serious. It's that the standard of success is so ridiculously high. We've got to be right all the time, as we used to say in the intelligence community. The terrorists only have to be good once for us to fail. And that's bad enough if you're looking for a Times Square bombing, which we've gotten lucky recently, or trying to stop guys with explosive underwear getting on airplanes. But can you imagine trying to stop a small group of people, not bigger than Muhammad Atta's little group of 19 hijackers, that are determined to spend however long it's going to take to detonate a bomb in a U.S. city? That's the kind of threat that we're going to be dealing with in the future. And just to add a little counterpoint to some of the on the mood swing side of our panel here, I'm very aware we're going to face that prospect one day. And I think one of the things we need to worry about is confronting the threat, living beyond fear, as Matt said. I do not like the fear-mongering aspect of this. I've spent years on the circuit, I call it here, trying to give a very sober message without scaring people, because fear is not productive. And if enough fear will motivate people to do even worse things than terrorism, which is abrogation of civil liberties, have lack of faith in governance. And those are the real implications or consequences if we get this wrong and a nuclear terrorism event occurs. It's going to be the implications on our way of life and our values, and that's one of the reasons this is such an appealing attack for a terrorist group like Al-Qaeda that has global ambitions, is to do something that will have us challenge our very way of life and force us into an overreaction that will play into their objectives.
Valerie, what else?
I'm following everything Rolf is saying and agreeing with him, because imagine, heaven forbid, that a nuclear weapon is detonated in a city in the United States. It could even just be just a dirty bomb, the psychological fear. But I believe our Bill of Rights that we take for granted, civil liberties, would be, I think, evaporated, because, as it says in the film, not because we have an authoritarian government, but I think that because people would be demanding that their security, that not happen or spread further. I did want to ask Rolf, back to the nation state rather than the terrorist side of things in Pakistan particularly, how do you judge, because from my experience, the Pakistani command and control, a very volatile country, how do you judge their command and control system now over their nuclear program? Do you think that they have been able to stabilize it?
I think it's very clear that the Pakistani military, which is the entity in Pakistan that controls the nuclear arsenal, is very professional and highly skilled and has a very good shot, not perfect. In fact, as Matt and I have talked many times, there's no such thing as perfect security, which is where our problems start. And I think they have good mechanisms to control it. The Pakistanis are dealing with three unique problems, perhaps, of all the nuclear haves. Is they have extremism of a higher concentration than most. They have greater instability, and unfortunately, their program's growing. And the way it's growing is to move from highly enriched uranium bombs, which are bigger and pose certain challenges, but to plutonium bombs, which are more lethal, smaller, and will require new facilities. So you're seeing an expansion, we're witnessing an expansion of facilities, an expansion of people and capabilities that, of course, increases just the actuarial odds. And I like people like Warren Buffett, who, when they talk about this problem, I take great consolation in a morbid way that they treat it so seriously, because they're looking at this as very successful businessmen who understand it on a continuum. If we go on like this for 50 years, with not reducing this odds to zero, which gets you back to radical solutions like global zero or eliminating nuclear weapons, if you don't do things that are radical and we stay on the trajectory we're on, it's almost inevitable we're going to experience an attempt. Hopefully they won't get it right. Hopefully we'll intercept it and the world will wake up. But I think the odds that we're not going to experience a major, sort of incident of some sort over the next, and I'll take the optimistic view to the point. I'll say I'm hopeful that we'll stop it and we'll wake up that way, or they won't get it right. But I think we're going to experience that before we're going to get jarred into the kind of action that we need to take.
Mm-hmm.
I had the good fortune to serve on a commission that Congress established, which was a successor to the 9/11 Commission. And this was a bipartisan commission chaired by Bob Graham, the former Democratic senator from Florida, and Jim Talent, former Republican senator from Missouri, and 9 people from Republicans and Democrats. And then we gave our report to the new administration and Congress in the end of 2008. And that report starts with the conclusion, unanimous conclusion of these 9 people, most of whom hadn't been part of this topic at all before, that on the current trajectory, the likelihood of a successful weapons of mass destruction terrorist attack somewhere in the world between now and the end of 2013 was greater than even. So that was the judgment of this group.
That was including nuclear and biological.
Nuclear and biological, yes. So I'm going to do one more question here, but let me suggest to the audience that we're coming to the part of the program in which your questions or comments will be welcome. There are 2 microphones on the ground floor, and there are 2 microphones at the loges, and you just line up, and we'll come to you as soon as we finish the next question here. So I would say for takeaways from this, okay, what would we say about takeaways? Here we're saying, what should a person who's not otherwise deeply engaged in this topic, but now taking this as an occasion to get a bit of a picture, what's the takeaway?
I'll use my takeaway moment to be a proponent for a group that I'm involved with. Rolf had mentioned it, Global Zero. You can go to globalzero.org. They are an international organization that is dedicated to the ultimate elimination of nuclear weapons. This is not some let's hold hands, pie in the sky, let's just hope it all works. What I like so much about this particular organization is they are doing it on a grassroots level all the way up through the political leadership across, and it's former Russian generals, it's student leaders, it's officials from around the world that have actually, many of them have been very deeply engaged in this issue for many years, and they realize that the only way ahead is to advocate the elimination. And that's not, of course, it has to be, we cannot do this unilaterally. It will not happen next Tuesday. It's going to take a really long time, but you have to start somewhere. And I believe in the United States, I mean, we have demonstrated before to the world that we can hold out these amazing goals. And we provide the leadership, whether it's the defeat of Hitler and rebuilding of Europe, or it's putting a man on a moon, or civil rights. I think this is the issue for the 21st century. Let's hold that out there as something that we, as in the international community, with the United States and Russia taking the leadership, to move toward. I think I and the other people that are working on this wouldn't be involved if we didn't think that there was a real chance of having it get done.
Good.
Quick takeaways. This is a serious problem. There are solutions, some of which are being partly implemented, but we need to do more. Individual people can make a difference. You should be contacting your senators about New START. You should be always pressing political candidates about what's your plan to deal with nuclear threats. You should be keeping yourself informed, maybe giving some money to some of the organizations that work on this kind of thing. So don't give up hope and get involved.
Yeah, just to add to that, the first thing would be, I believe this is a dire threat, an urgent threat, requires urgent response. I think the response is getting better, but it still isn't what I would call urgent enough. And to whatever extent as citizens you can believe in that or research it for yourself, I think my takeaway would be treat it with a great sense of urgency. It is preventable, as I think one of Graham's greatest contributions to this is to characterize it as a preventable catastrophe in his book, because it is. This is not a hopeless sort of thing. And I'll leave you with the thought as, as something, if you think of Oklahoma City bombing, the explosive effect of Oklahoma City was 2 tons. And Hiroshima, by contrast, was 13,000 tons, 13 kilotons, just to give you an idea of the magnitude. Nonetheless, we have to learn to live with the prospect as well, not put it out of our mind, live with the prospect, accept the possibility, and in that way, if and when it does happen, we can deal with it, I would say, more maturely, because we'll survive anything terrorists could throw at us.
Okay, so we have about 25 minutes for questions. we're going to suggest that the questions be brief. If you have a comment or a point of disagreement, that'll be welcome, as long as it's brief. And the ground rules are, please identify yourself, ask your question, and then I think for the panel, we shouldn't all have to try to answer every question. So if somebody has an answer, offer an answer. If we have disagreements, particularly, I think that would be valuable to say where there might be a point of disagreement. We'll start with this gentleman.
My name is Nasser Fazal. I run a little biotech company in Cambridge and I teach chemistry in a local university. As a 23-year-old, I was a senior scientific officer in Atomic Energy Commission of Pakistan doing radiation chemistry research. At that time, they were starting to enrich, later I found out, they were starting to enrich uranium at Kahuta. And believe it or not, I did not know that they were doing the enrichment. They were so secret, so confidential. So since I've been here, I've been reading in the local media, all about it. And it's very interesting. I just want to state that. My question is this. Just before, in South Africa, just before Mr. Mandela's regime, Shimon Peres went to South Africa to sell some kind of missile technology. And then he offered to give them the nuclear technology. And this has just come out a few months ago by a South African a graduate student who actually is starting to work with Foreign Affairs. And I don't hear this anywhere in the media that the Israelis started to try to proliferate the nuclear technology. Does any one of you ever heard about that?
Well, of course, the Israelis have denied that any such offer was made. There has been a long-standing controversy over, there clearly was some degree of nuclear cooperation between Israel and South Africa, and there has been a long-standing controversy over how far that went, and in particular, whether the mysterious flash near South Africa in 1979 was a nuclear detonation or not. I am among those who think probably not, but I imagine some of the others on the panel are among those who think probably so. I'm not sure. So I personally am skeptical that that particular offer that has been reported was made, but others may have a different view.
Anybody else have a view? I don't have. I suspect that the flash was a test. This lady, please.
Luca. I'm at the Fletcher School doing a master's program, and I also worked with Global Zero at their launch conference in Paris in 2008. And I have a question about China. Over the past week or so, we've been hearing a now very familiar mantra from the White House and in the media that China is the key to solving the North Korea problem, among others. And so I want to ask anyone who's interested in answering, what is the proper role of China in the short term for North Korea, particularly given its continued resistance to providing the kind of catalytic action that I think the United States would like it to provide? And also, what is the position of China in this longer term picture of Global Zero?
Well, I'll offer one thought. I think the Chinese, if I would be very surprised, I would say, if the Chinese are not rethinking all their calculations about North Korean behavior, just like the rest of the world. I think it was one thing, I don't think we would agree with China's approach before recent actions such as the North Korean sailed reactor to Syria and other things that cast serious doubt on whether we really should consider the regime as we would call a rational actor in nuclear terms. I don't think we could take off the table at all the possibility that the North Koreans are selling nuclear technologies to any bidder, which is something we didn't see in Pakistan. The AQ Khan network, that the Pakistanis, the rogue network that sold technology to Libya, Iran, North Korea, did have limits. There's no evidence, for example, that they collaborated with terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda. I'm very worried, and I think some of our panelists here as well, that we can't really, at this point, predict what the North Koreans do. I hope that's worrying the Chinese as much as it's worrying the United States.
This is one where I do disagree with Rolf a little bit. I am strongly of the view that for a man like Kim Jong-il, the key priority is staying in power, and handing over the greatest power he's ever acquired to a terrorist group that's going to use it in some way that might bring a retaliation that would remove him from power forever is not something I think he's likely to do. I'm not saying it's zero probability, but my guess is it's a relatively small portion of the overall nuclear terrorist threat. But getting back to China, the reality is they have different interests with respect to North Korea than we do. They have a strong interest in maintaining the stability of that regime, not having refugees pouring across their borders, not having a unified, very powerful U.S. ally coming right up to their border. I think getting them to do what would be in our interest when it's not necessarily in their interest is going to be difficult to do. But I agree with Rolf that I think they're probably recalculating now exactly what their interests are, given how much risk to them the North Koreans are creating by their irresponsible behavior.
Yeah, and I would just add, North Korea, all bets are off because it clearly is a cult masquerading as a state. I don't think that you can make that assumption that, what is in their best interest, that they don't want to give away. The normal rules do not apply when it comes to North Korea. And it's been so frustrating for the rest of the world to say, come on, China, get engaged. And I think finally maybe they have their attention, but they are sort of acting like that adolescent teenager who is, out after curfew time after time after time. And we haven't, and as a community, as an international community, what are our options? There are very few. And that's the scary part.
I don't want us to do too much on North Korea, but I'll make a slightly different view of even of these. I would say first, if it were not for Israel's bombing a reactor in Syria would be producing plutonium today. Okay? So can North Korea sell to a state the stuff from which they could make a bomb? They did. So this is not I don't think, a hypothetical. Now, could they sell then something hugely smaller than that, like thousands of times smaller? I'm afraid they could. So Matt and I have loved to argue this, but I would say that's at least my view. But thirdly, on your Chinese point, the proposition that Matt and I strongly agree with is that the Chinese see their interests different than the U.S. has, and we've told them they should do A, B, C, and D, all the things that we would like, as opposed to having our hierarchy of interests saying the most essential thing is no nuclear weapons or nuclear technology outside of North Korea. Do that, and you're crossing a red line that's just too far. And then you'll have to be punished for that. But because the North Koreans have successfully deterred the South Koreans with the threat to destroy Seoul, and because the South Koreans are the reason we're there, we're also, in some sense, frozen. So I think, long story, but this lady's next.
Hi, my name's Megan Jennis. I'm a second-year Master's in Public Policy student here at the Kennedy School. I admire the goals of Global Zero, but it seems to me that there is a knowledge problem in that if you are to eliminate all nuclear weapons in the world, the knowledge of how to make a nuclear weapon still exists. So I'm wondering if you can speak to how you address this knowledge issue and ensure that terrorists don't create a small bomb off of diagrams that they can find on the internet.
I'll just start by saying one thing that I learned through my experience working at the CIA, making a nuclear bomb very much is an art, not a science, thank goodness. You can't go on, it's sort of, people like to say, well, you could go on the internet and find the diagrams and sort of, hook up wires and there you go. It's not quite that easy, thank goodness, which is not to say that the knowledge base is broad and widespread. I think Global Zero's approach to that is very systematic. It has to be orchestrated and disciplined, starting with locking down all fissile material. The knowledge still might, will always, the internet will live forever, and so it will always be there. But the first step will be, getting this START treaty, the new START treaty ratified, and then you begin slowly to gather international consensus. We've done it before. We've done it with chemical and biological weapons. Although they do still exist in the world, they are considered taboo. And if we can somewhere begin to approach that same paradigm with nuclear weapons, then that would be a step in the right direction.
A key point is that our existing nuclear weapons don't solve that problem for us either. I mean, it's not like having our strategic nuclear arsenal protects us against nuclear terrorists. So getting rid of those nuclear weapons is certainly not going to make the problem worse. And it might make the problem a lot better.
Please.
I was just going to add one quick thing on as an intelligence officer, the way I've chosen to look at this is as an intelligence challenge, grand challenge. If you get to this point you're talking about near zero, you've got to assume cheating, and you've got to assume near not perfect security, which we've been saying. So to be consistent with that, you have to have something that you'd have to have almost perfect, which is a kind of an international verification regime. That would have to be extraordinary. It'd have to be nothing like anything we talk about today. The International Atomic Energy Agency, as currently mandated and carrying out its work, is in no way equipped to do this. Neither is there an international culture for multilateral intelligence cooperation that would get you anywhere near where you need to be to prevent the kind of, which would really be a disaster if you get near zero and then you find out terrorists are the only people in the world with nuclear weapons. So you got to treat it very seriously, but I think I really do believe you can do that. That kind of regime, again, as an intelligence, would require something as dramatic as creating a global intelligence capacity. It would require technology that maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago is not just a dream, which would be, for example, standoff detection from airplanes or possibly even satellites, standoff detection of nuclear materials. You have to have a way to almost be absolutely certain you can detect very low levels of uranium enrichment that might be occurring in a warehouse or people working on a bomb in a specific garage. And so the challenges are extraordinarily daunting. But do I think you could do it, at least in a utopian sense that global zero spirit is written anyway? Yeah, I think it's possible.
I think it's easier than Rolf makes it out, but harder from the technology point of view. I think as Rolf says, you should assume that there's a danger there's going to be cheating. Therefore, I think we got to think hard about what we mean by zero. So zero might mean a world where the states that have nuclear weapons now each have 50 nuclear weapons that are disassembled, and there's UN guys with blue berets watching over them, but they could be reassembled fairly rapidly if someone was cheating and they were needed. That would put nuclear weapons on the back burner of international politics, hopefully forever, and make us, a very substantially safer world. And yet it wouldn't be grossly vulnerable to, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king.
This gentleman, please.
Good evening. My name is Alexander Rasalimo. I'm president of the Center for Security and Social Progress, a think tank. The focus of your discussion has been on the danger of a nuclear explosion. Well, back in 1991, almost 20 years ago, I read a summary of a report by the head of special security lab at a Russian secret city called Chelyabinsk. And he claimed that a conventional explosion of a small tactical nuclear weapon that is blowing up with dynamite, for instance, without triggering a nuclear detonation, can be as dangerous to the population as its atomic nuclear detonation. That's because if this happens in a big urban center, the scattered plutonium would contaminate the city, and anybody inhaling a microscopic particle would invariably die of lung cancer. Plus, it would be almost impossible to decontaminate. Plutonium has a half-life of 28,000 years. It might either cost hundreds of billions of dollars or could not be done. So my question to you is, how do you assess the danger, the threat of a dirty bomb with plutonium? How capable or likely are terrorists to have one and to use one?
Well, I think he was wrong in saying that it would be as great a danger as a nuclear weapon actually detonating. It would be an expensive and nasty mess, and you might well have to evacuate a major part of an urban area for a substantial period and spend billions of dollars cleaning up. But that's totally different from a big chunk of that urban area being incinerated in a nuclear blast. I would also say that the dirty bomb problem is much broader than plutonium. At the hospital right down the street at Mount Auburn, there are radioactive sources that would make a really nasty, dirty bomb if you managed to get them and disperse them. And that's true at every hospital you can think of, pretty much, at least in developed countries. And we're in the process of busily exporting that kind of thing to hospitals in developing countries so that people can have those kinds of medical treatments. So the dirty bomb problem it really is a different problem. It's a weapons of mass disruption problem rather than a weapons of mass destruction problem. At least as much of the emphasis for that problem needs to be on response after it happens, on educating the public about what the real dangers of radiation are and aren't, because the public thinks radiation is much more dangerous than it actually is. There is some stuff that we need to do to get those things under better basic levels of security, but we'll never be able to say, every radiological source that would be dangerous in the world everywhere is accounted for and has good security, because there's millions of those, as opposed to, there are hundreds of buildings where there's either a nuclear weapon or a lot of nuclear material. There's not thousands of those buildings. So hundreds is a big job to lock it all down, but it's a doable job.
Let's go to this gentleman.
I have two questions or two comments. The one is, I think the elephant in the room is Israel. Whilst Israel has supported safety in the West, it has fomented trouble in the Middle East. And it stands as a threat to world peace because of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And I don't think that nuclear device is going to be detonated in the United States. It's going to happen somewhere in the Middle East. The second comment that I have to make, oh, by the way, I didn't introduce myself. My name is Dan Cohen, and I wish you all a happy Hanukkah. The second comment is, why reduce the number of nuclear weapons? Why not zero? Bertrand Russell was talking about this in the 50s and 60s. Why don't we, the United States, the most advanced country in the Western world, or so we call ourselves that, just take the lead and say, get rid of these things. We are perpetuating the problem by keeping an arsenal of nuclear weapons.
Okay, two questions. Let's have two short comments, if whoever wants to comment on whichever.
Israel?
I guess everybody's pushing me to take Israel. All right.
Briefly.
The reality is Israel's had a nuclear stockpile for a long time. That's a problem. I believe that every state that has nuclear weapons is a problem. So I'm not going to say nuclear weapons are fine anywhere. But when you think about nuclear terrorism specifically, the Israelis have a lot of experience with terrorism and with securing things against terrorism. My guess is that they have higher levels of security for their stockpile, although they're completely non-transparent about it, since they don't even acknowledge that the stockpile exists. So I don't spend a lot of time worrying about theft of Israeli nuclear weapons myself.
If I could just add, this is a little mischief-making, but can you imagine what would happen if Israel announced a nuclear-free Middle East zone starting, say, 24 months hence? We got to give them time to figure. Right. It would rock everyone on that nation or in that region back on their heels, and they'd have to, can you imagine? How would?
Unfortunately, it's not going to happen.
I know,
but it's a bold idea.
To your second question, it could happen somewhere else. That's the bottom line. We are fixated, maybe in some respects, on the U.S., mainly because Al-Qaeda's represented their intent has been a largely U.S.-based intent. But I think places like Israel or Moscow, or for that, as President Obama said again in Prague, he listed a whole number of cities. I think it's extraordinarily important for the world citizens to see it as everyone's problem, it's not a U.S. problem.
Just one footnote on Israel. I would say I have tried to offer to Israeli officials my view that while they say Iran is the existential threat to Israel because it might acquire nuclear weapons in a couple of years, I would think if I were responsible for Israeli security that nuclear terrorism is the thing I would worry about, because one nuclear bomb in Tel Aviv would change that country. One nuclear bomb in the U.S. will change our world, but the U.S. will survive. But Israel is a much riskier story. This gentleman.
Hello, my name is Ian Kelly. I'm a freshman at Tufts University. Sam Nunn, William Perry, George Schultz, and Henry Kissinger have described getting rid of nuclear weapons as similar to climbing a mountain. Somewhere in the clouds on top of the mountain is a world without nuclear weapons. How do we get there? They have also said that if we don't start taking small steps, we're never going to reach the top. I prescribe to this as long as each step increases global security and stability. And I've heard a lot of great stuff in articles about broad objectives, overall things of how we get there. I'm wondering specifically now, what kinds of questions and what kind of papers need to be written to make a couple of small next steps that will increase security and get us towards global zero?
Fantastic question, and sounds like a willing worker. So what should he write about that would take small steps that would make it safer on the route?
Just very quickly, if you look at the steps to global zero, the very big ones, and you broke those down, things like, okay, start radical reductions of arms control, US, Russian. Then you bring in a way of developing a security regime for nuclear materials that are part of the energy cycle. So that's a whole, we call the nuclear renaissance because there's so much interest. That's a second big area to look at. Third is what we call the cutoff of fissile material, the fissile cutoff treaty. That's another big area to look into and ways that we can get out of this conundrum we're in where we can't seem to get there. And then the fourth block is the idea of this verification regime again that we've already mentioned. And then the fifth would be how do you actually construct a treaty, a global treaty to get rid of the weapons. So looking at all those and then picking out a part that you're particularly interested in, they're all very lucrative. I love to say to student groups, I can't think of a more exciting world from a global security, national security perspective than looking at these new problems that people have the big parts figured out, but they haven't got all the how are we actually going to do it.
Good question, good answer. This lady, please.
Hi, my name is Brody Kemp. I'm finishing a PhD in the government department. I wanted to ask two questions. You spoke, the session, at least the introduction, was primarily about the nature of the threat, or the fact that there is a threat. Once we're all on board and recognize that there is this threat and begin to push toward next steps, first I'd like to ask about where you see American leadership being most useful. I think the nature of American power is shifting. It's certainly going to be shifting over the next 50 years, both with the rise of other powers and our resources are being stretched in ways we didn't foresee. So where do you see American leadership being most useful over that period? Second, as former intel officers or current intel officers, I wonder if you could speak to the role of intelligence and the way the intelligence community ought to be responding to this. We've spoken in terms of solutions, in terms of how big powers ought to deal with this and what sort of policy solutions we ought to push toward. So I guess I'd like to ask you where you see, if we're going to address the one problem, that's a role for intelligence. That's not going to be a big policy solution. So I wonder whether you could speak to that.
Great questions, please.
Let me take very briefly your first question. I think we really do have a moment in time. We have this window of opportunity. We have first as candidate, now as President Obama, who has said unequivocally, here's where we want to go. And he really has driven this process. They signed the treaty with President Medvedev in April of this year. And so I think getting the leadership, it is going to be done. Of course, these treaties are done at the highest levels, but there is a role for individuals and for society. There are some scenes in the film where we forgot about this. Remember, in the 70s and 80s, there were protests against nuclear, the expansion of nuclear power. They show some of the during Kennedy's years when I guess he wanted to reduce, was it missile testing, nuclear testing?
Atmospheric nuclear testing was the big
and he quipped, if he got rapturous applause every time he spoke about this. And he quipped, if I'd known this was so popular, I would have done this a long time ago. So it can be tapped into. And that's where the leadership, of course, will be the ones to sign the treaty, but I think it's incumbent upon all of us to figure out what little bit can I do to advance? So do you want to take the second part?
Somebody want to take the first question?
On the second question, on the intelligence, very, very quickly, and I think it basically, the intelligence community in a way is like fighting the battle at Little Bighorn to hold out long enough for the cavalry of policy to arrive. So if you want to look at it in the nuclear terrorism context, we're trying to find the threats that exist today and the ones tomorrow, because intelligence, by the time the threats are downstream, and terrorists have capability, and they're trying to put a plot into motion. Unfortunately, I think, because it's a very hard, demanding job, intelligence has got a disproportionate part of the responsibility to stop the threat from culminating in an attack. Now, what you have to do in the mid to long term, though, is reduce any stream of capability that's going, because you're not going to change intent probably very easily, so that the nuclear security part that Matt and others are championing, and certainly here at Belfer, we're so prominent, and it's certainly why I'm proud to be here, you know, that the policy prescriptions that are put into motion, like the Nuclear Security Summit, the Strengthening Non-Proliferation Treaty, all these measures begin to reduce the flow of anything downstream to terrorists to a trickle and ultimately stop it completely. And that makes the job of intelligence obviously easy, because the terrorists can't get there even if they have the intent. So that basically is, I think, the relationship of intelligence to policy. And I think the reason intelligence has been disproportionately important since 9/11, not just with nuclear terrorism, but terrorism writ large, is because we found it very difficult to develop effective policy to stop extremism that results in terrorism. So we've disproportionately relied, frankly, as an intelligence officer, I'm not comfortable with a policy, for example, that's as heavily oriented towards predator strikes as U.S. policy is now, but the sort of sober, bitter reality is that's what's working right now to kill terrorists before they kill us, and therefore it's still got a lot of support in the United States. But ultimately, I hope we don't rely on those kinds of means, because we have a better policy in the end that reduces the sources of extremism that fuels the terrorism.
Unfortunately, we're coming towards the end. We have two last questions. Noella says we have time for this gentleman, and I apologize for the others that are standing. Apologies, but you're next.
Good evening. My name is Gavin Pascarelle. I'm a student here at the college. My question also regards North Korea, but also are under different circumstances. If for some reason the North Korean government were to lose control, or for some reason to collapse, what capabilities do the United States, China, Japan, or South Korea have to secure this nuclear material, and how effective are those capabilities should this happen?
That's a gigantic challenge. In particular, unless you know where the stuff is, it's pretty hard to go in there and secure it. So there are a lot of different scenarios. I can imagine, and this, by the way, it's not just a North Korea problem. One can imagine, this was a problem that existed in the Soviet Union, and it's a problem one could imagine occurring, for example, in Pakistan at some point down the road. I think it's farther away anywhere else than it is in North Korea right now. But you could imagine scenarios where some of the responsible people, in the final moments said, oh my God, things really are falling apart, and calls somebody and says, this is where you should go and you should come pick them up. Short of that, it's going to be a huge challenge, because if you're trying to fight your way in to get them, it's a deeply problematic situation. I am highly confident that we have plans and studies on that topic, but none of them look pretty.
If you want an even more discouraging account, I would say the wiki leak that was in the newspaper story yesterday in the New York Times has a conversation between the fellow who's now the national security advisor to the president of South Korea, reassuring the U.S. ambassador that everything is going to be okay, that you can feel comfortable that North Korea is going to collapse within the next 2 to 3 years, that's the statement, and that the Chinese will understand that South Korea is going to absorb North Korea, and that while they wouldn't like the idea of an American military ally now being on their border, and they would look unfavorably on American military troops being in North Korea, he was confident things were okay. Now, and the Times reported this as if this was, they just reported that, well, this is what he said. And the ambassador there wrote back to Washington reporting that this is what he said. And I wrote to David Sanger, my colleague who had written the story, and said, you should put there should be a note here, message, takeaways. This fellow must be delusional, okay? Yeah. And secondly, about our ambassador. Is the ambassador delusional as well, or just doesn't want to say? Okay. But I took no reassurance at all from, it made me even more worried. So this gentleman gets the last question.
Okay, my name is Sean Morrissey. I am educated as a physicist and a computer scientist.
But my question has to do with the badge that I carry. It's Emergency Medical Services. I am Deputy Chief, Weapons of Mass Destruction and Mass Casualty Response in a small town in New Hampshire. And we worry about it because all of you responders in the city are what we call targets. It's going to be our problem.
You bet.
But I am not, because of my background, I'm aware how difficult it is to get a full-blown fission explosion. So I think a radiological incident is very much more likely. And that's what I'm going to have to deal with. And I am less afraid of the weapon than I am of the fear and the irrational response. Where is the educational module that goes in to the public system at age 12 where you start being a little bit more rational about your response to this? Because that's my fear, the panic, not the bomb.
Okay, good. Excellent question. Let me take part of it, and then let me see who would like to take. I think first, for your work as a citizen in the emergency management response system, fantastic, and I would say thank you. The little town where I live next door here in Belmont also has such a group that my wife's part of. I think that if a bomb were to go off, or a dirty bomb were to go off, or a chemical event, or a biological event, the first responders are not coming from Washington. Okay. You guys are going to be there, for better or worse, and so the fact that you're thinking about and preparing it, I think is a great example of citizen responsibility. So I applaud that very much. I think secondly, nobody who, on this panel, I'm sure, would disagree with the proposition that a dirty bomb, that is a blast of TNT that disperses some radioactive material, most likely material from a hospital, as Matt was saying, that will not be all that deadly, but will be hugely frightening, just as you say, is much more likely than a real nuclear bomb exploding with a fission event. It's just that the fission event, if it happened, is so much more destructive that when you run likelihoods and consequences together, what to worry about? Well, both. Now then, with respect to your specific question of what the community has done to help people understand better what the risks are, Matt already had started talking to that. So do you want to take that part?
Well, it's a great point, and the reality is the module you're looking for, as far as I know, doesn't exist. I mean, there are trainings available for people like yourself who are first responders. My impression is they're not that great, most of them.
Deadly important subject, deadly boring.
Right, exactly. But the education for the general public is a really hard problem, in part because, let's face it, the government and industry have lied to the public in the past about radiation and dangers, and the public is perfectly aware of that and has at least a hazy memory, probably an exaggerated memory of those lies. And so it's not obvious sort of how to create a public education program that is credible and that people will listen to. And in particular, how to create an emergency one when the thing happens. Because no matter what public education you do now, there are some people who won't have gotten the message, and you're going to have emergency communications that are credible. And we've seen in the anthrax case, we had all sorts of emergency communications that were completely wrong, and that hurt us.
I'm not talking about the short-term response. I'm talking about, okay, start solving
Right.
the
Well, I'm
problem
talking
with
about
today's
both.
12-year-olds
Right, I
and see if we can grow into a rational response. But I think it's a
extremely good question and helps identify yet another problem to work on. Unfortunately, we haven't come to conclusions about all the topics that have been raised, but we've come to the end. Let me sum up as follows. I'm very honored to have such a distinguished panel, and we're glad that Valerie came from Santa Fe, especially for this event. And we applaud the work that all of these folks are doing, and at the Belfer Center, we've got a whole group of another 20, 30 people for whom this is what they do and what they care about. I think the film has done a good job in helping raise consciousness about this. And so for discussion that won't be the end of the story, but that's, I think, helped raise a number of the most interesting questions. Let's say thank you very much to the panel. Good.